Unlike the classical heroes, we're not going on our journey to save the world, but to save ourselves.
And in doing that, you save the world. I mean, you do. The influence of a vital person, it vitalizes. There's no doubt about it. The world is a wasteland. People have the notion of saving the world by shifting it around and changing the rules. No, any world is a living world if it's alive. And the thing is to bring it to life. And the way to bring it to life is to find in your own case where your life is and be alive yourself, it seems to me.
Heresy shouldn't be this much fun, but it just is. It just is. And yes, this is Aeon Byte Gnostic Radio, an initiation by conversation into the dark corners of myth, magic, and meaning. A crash course in cult culture and conspiracy. A virtuous virus invoking and informing history, holiness, and heresy. Each week I, your host, Miguel Connor, commandeers your connection to bring the most accepted and rejected scholars and provocateurs to your attention. Fun, compelling, and deeply weird, this is the blow-your-mind cocktail party conversation you always wanted to listen in on.
God isn't for you, Lenny. God is for men who have no use for freedom.
Yes, sir, and yes, ma'am. I just mentioned about this venture being a virtuous virus. After all, reality has gotten very weird in the 21st century. The Industrial Revolution displaced man from nature. The nuclear age displaced man from his humanity. And the digital age is displacing man from his identity. Today, across the social media and internet landscapes, disjointed moralities and human identities pull into desperate speculations to find some long-lost self and tech coping skill, as well as some glimmer of a future escape of this protean species mess. That's reality, and that's what reality has become.
Let me tell you why you're here. You're here because you know something. What you know you can't explain, but you feel it. You felt it your entire life, that there's something wrong with the world. You don't know what it is, but it's there, like a splinter in your mind, driving you mad.
But reality is just doing what reality is meant to be doing. Reality is an angel-manufactured virus that self-replicates, continually makes copies of itself, and fragments everything it touches, just as it did after it found its first host in that first human. And after 100,000 years or so, here we are, infected with complex reality, not very virtuous, all meant to keep our origins beyond the stars hidden. But we're finally seeing the Gnostic warning from those 2nd century three-eyed Christians Philip K. Dick wrote about in Valis. And it's injecting the antidote that is Promethean self-knowledge and ritualistic connection to transcendental planes. It is becoming that homoplasmate, as Dick further said. He also wrote in his exegesis on reality, quote, "My big question remains, how, quote, faked is our own phenomenal world? At one end, the answer could be, it is a partially viewed reality. At the other end, it is a total hypnotic delusion. But that black iron prison, that is real. I used to be in that prison." Then again, it was Groucho Marx who said, "I'm not crazy about reality, but it's the best place to get a decent meal."
Well, I've wrestled with reality for 35 years, Doctor, and I'm happy to state I finally won out over it.
Regardless of where you are, I'm glad you're here with me for that medicament in the form of my pompatus of gnosis. Part of the cure is, as I've always said, tapping into the power of myth to hack all of reality. Myths aren't silly stories or coy lies, but the secret language of the spirit, the symphony of symbols, images, and metaphors that lead to wholeness and direct us to the unity of the collective unconscious that paradoxically strengthens our individuality. So with self-knowledge, knowledge of our origins beyond this Hotel California, and the power of myth, we get that virtuous virus to reverse the fragmenting of the virus that is reality.
A reality is just what we tell each other it is. Sane and insane could easily switch places if the insane were to become the majority. You would find yourself locked in a padded cell, wondering what happened to the world.
Doing all of this and more, our astral guest will be Bernie Taylor, who materializes at the virtual Alexandria to discuss his new book, Before Orion, Finding the Face of the Hero. I enjoyed the book, and if you like the vibe of Gordon White's Starships, the astrotheology of my dearly departed Acharya S., even the intro quote by Joseph Campbell I provided, or anything Jungian, you'll enjoy the book too, and certainly our interview. Before Orion explores a deeper root for this monomyth by looking at how hunter-gatherers viewed themselves within the natural and spiritual worlds through Paleolithic cave art from 40,000 years ago. From there, we also explore ancient Egyptian lore and constructs, Greek and Roman mythopoeia, Persian mysticism, and plenty of esoteric archaeology and anthropology. Bernie's insights will open your doors of perception and get you a first-class ticket into the collective unconscious to find your hero face, your virtuous virus.
We just had a near-life experience.
For more information on Bernie and his dynamic work, please visit, beforeorion.can. As Rush sang in Tom Sawyer, catch the myth, catch the myth, catch the mystery, catch the drift. And certainly continue to catch the power of myth. Like Joseph Campbell wrote, traditionally, the first function of a living mythology is to reconcile consciousness to the preconditions of its own existence. That is to say, the nature of life. Life is a horrendous presence, and you wouldn't be here if it weren't for that. A mythological order has been said to reconcile consciousness to this fact. The second function of mythology, then, is to present an image of the cosmos that will maintain your sense of mystical awe and explain everything that you come into contact with in the universe around you. The third function of a mythological order is to validate and maintain a certain sociological system, a shared set of rights and wrongs, proprieties, on which your particular social unit depends for its existence. The fourth function of mythology is psychological. The myth must carry the individual through the stages of his life, from birth through maturity, through senility to death. The mythology must do so in accord with social order of his group, the cosmos as understood by his group, and the monstrous mystery.
And the attitude is not to withdraw from the world when you realize how horrible it is, but to realize that this horror is simply the foreground of a wonder, and come back and participate in it.
And like the brilliant June Singer wrote in her book, A Gnostic Book of Hours, myths are true expressions of our inner selves, revealed cryptically in image, symbol, and metaphor. They are something like dreams. Rationally, they may not ring true, but in a psychological sense, they express people's inner processes through the use of ingenious devices that conceal what must be concealed and reveal what must be revealed. And coming back to Campbell, old Joe Papa also wrote, myths are public dreams. Dreams are private myths. By finding your own dream and following it through, it will lead you to the myth world in which you live. But just as in a dream, the subject and object, though they seem to be separate, are really the same.
You ever have that feeling where you're not sure if you're awake or still dreaming?
Everything is backwards now. Like out there is the true world, and in here is the dream.
And lastly, let me quote Jung, as Bernie Wilby discussed Jung aplenty in our interview. The Swiss magician did say, meaning makes a great many things endurable, perhaps everything. No science will ever replace myth, and myth cannot be made out of any science. For it is not that, quote, God is a myth, but that myth is revelation of a divine life in man. But enough of my drivel. Led us to our first part of our interview with Bernie Taylor on his book, Before Orion. Thanks to you Moon Age daydreamers who keep this Red Pill cafeteria open with your support. I can't do it without you. But together, we cure the virus that is reality with the myths that ground us to higher states of, yes, reality.
You're all individuals! Yes, we're all individuals!
In the world I see, you're stalking out through the damn canyon forest around the ruins of Rockefeller Center. You'll wear leather clothes that will last you the rest of your life. You'll climb the wrist-thick cuts of vines that wrap the Sears Tower. And when you look down, you'll see tiny figures pounding corn, laying strips of venison in the empty carpool lane of some abandoned superhighway.
This is the Aeon Byte interview, and with us we definitely have the pleasure of being joined by Bernie Taylor to discuss his book, Before Orion, Finding the Face of the Hero. How are you doing today, Bernie?
I'm doing great, Miguel. Thanks for having me on the show.
Pleasure is all ours, and thank you for being here and taking your time. And with us we've got Vance. Have you found the face of your hero, Vance?
Oh, all the time. They're passing every day.
All right, wonderful. Glad to have you on, too. So, Bernie, let's start with you. As I like to ask a lot of times, tell us a little bit about yourself and how you came to write Before Orion.
Well, most books that people write or projects people begin started someplace else, somewhere deeper in our past. Before Orion was a sort of continuance of another book I wrote, Biological Time, which explored how plants and animals are timed, and then knowledge by ancient indigenous peoples. So how did the Native Americans know that the salmon would be running up the rivers and they would spawn? But then again, how did the salmon coordinate all these activities? And of course, how did geese to migrate and timing and flowers to bloom and synchrony, all these sorts of things. So it was about chronobiology and biological clocks and looking at from a indigenous perspective. Then there was I also looked at deer and elk, the timing when they drop their when they rut, when they drop their antlers, and so on. And someone said, you got to look in the Paleolithic. And I looked in this cave called Lascaux in France, dating to about 17,000 years ago. On the wall in this cave, there's a megaloceros. Now, we've never seen a megaloceros because they've been extinct for a long time. But think of an elk on steroids, just absolutely huge, just something that shouldn't be in the natural world. So like the Soviet or the Russian Olympic team, it just doesn't, something's out of whack. Well, it's a different animal and it's huge. and under that megaloceros, there's 13 dots that lead to a box. And in how Native Americans and other hunter-gatherers around the world, they time off the moon. And they count from the crescent moon 13 to the full moon. And the full moon became a box. And I found these other boxes in these numbers, this nomenclature that coincided with the moon. So they were hunting by the moon, which is people do that in modern times as well. So I said to myself, well, after that book was finished, that was 13, 14 years ago. I said to myself, maybe it's more to this, but I'm going to put it aside for a few years and see how that all plays out. And the biological clock stuff became mainstream. But the concept of going forward to the Paleolithic, what did we know back when? Well, about 4 years ago, I kind of resumed the project. I started counting the dots again, and I went into an older cave, El Castillo Cave near Bilbao in the Cantabria region of Spain. So we're talking northwestern Spain, up by the ocean, by the Pacific. And El Castillo is famous because of a panel called the Panel of Hands. And there's a dot on the Panel of Hands that was dated to about 40,000 years ago. It's about the size of your hand, this actual dot. And it was huge because 40,000 years ago, earliest artwork, could be Neanderthal, could be Homo sapiens. No one really knew what it was. But there really wasn't much of a story to tell in this one dot, even though there's a sequence of dots stenciled hands across the panel. Well, in the image of this dot wasn't very interesting either. So the media went with another image in the gallery of discs in the same chamber, and it's a fabulous image. The dots have a clear pattern. There's not a lot of other things interfering with it. And millions of people in both the popular science and academic media had seen this image. And so I looked at that image, and I said to myself, this thing is 10 meters across, so we're talking about 30 feet American. It's huge, and it's pretty clear to see. Well, I also thought about, in the Paleolithic, the most common animal was the horse. So almost every cave is represented by multiple horses. And you got this huge panel. And I said, well, maybe there's a horse in there. So I started looking for a horse. Well, I didn't find a horse till 3 years later. But within minutes, I found an elephant. Did you see the elephant when you looked in the book?
Yes, I did, Bernie. It's very interesting.
Well, there's something unique about that elephant. Because there were elephants in Europe at the time. They were straight tusk, and straight tusk elephants had this humped head. The elephant you saw in the picture, do you remember that you see was kind of a flattish head, or was like a big hump?
I think I saw it was the flat one.
It was a flat head, exactly.
Yes.
A flat head, that type of elephant is a African elephant. So we have an African elephant in the European cave. And so the artist had been to Africa. And as I went through the panel, I found more animal beings and human beings as well. And I connected with someone from my past. His name is George Schaller, Dr. George Schaller. And George is considered the foremost wildlife biologist in the world. He's the mentor to everybody, including Jane Goodall. He did gorillas before she did chimps. Well, George and I, we went through these animal beings one by one, and we figured out which ones were European and which ones are African. And there was one that was African that was super significant. Actually, two that were super significant. One was the giraffe. And there were no giraffe. People can argue about, whether or not they were what kind of elephant is, but you can't argue about the giraffe. And so we have a giraffe in an image in Spain. And the other one was the Barbary macaque. If you remember the Barbary macaque, you've seen this before. They're indigenous to the Atlas Mountains of Morocco, which is northwestern Africa. However, you remember from a James Bond movie, Living Daylights. James Bond, another 007 has been taken out. James Bond chases him down the slopes at the Rock of Gibraltar. Barbary macaques bouncing off the roof. Big chase scene. And James Bond, I can't remember if he does get the bad guy. But he does. We do see Barbary macaques, but Barbary macaques have only been in Europe and Gibraltar for the past few hundred years, as introduced by Europeans. They're indigenous to the Atlas Mountains of West North Africa. So this story developed, a story between people that were in northern Europe, or actually northern Spain, and people that had traveled to Africa. And this was the first time in the archaeological record that there's been a connection between Europe and Africa. So who came from where and all that sort of stuff is entirely based on DNA. There has been no other art demonstrated or any artifacts that people had traveled between the two places. When you looked at the image, do you remember seeing the giraffe?
Yes, I remember seeing it, yes. And I do remember the James Bond movie. It was with Pierce Brosnan, so it wasn't one of my favorites, but yes. And I saw the giraffe.
Did Pierce get the bad guy on the chase?
Yes, I believe he did. It's been a while, but yes, James Bond.
Lance is smirking right now, I bet. And how does James Bond tie into Paleolithic rock art?
Hey, that's fun.
Well, it does, because it does tie in, because we're very Eurocentric in our thinking and our history, and so we refer back to these Western motifs. Well, George and I, we spent almost 2 years working on these animals, figuring out what was from where, and what was most significant about this is I'm asking George taxonomic details, to make sure it is what it is, and also what kind of drafts and how do we really know the Barbary macaque. And the Barbary macaque has a huge butt, which is he has the widest butt of any ape. But George, that's not what he was coming back to me to say. George would come back and share that he talked about the touching scene between the two, the mother and the juvenile animal, and across the board. So what George was doing, he was portraying the empathy that he could see in these Paleolithic artists and how they portrayed the animal beings, which is very significant in this world, because people think that caveman is some sort of dark, he's in the dark caves, the dark ages. This person is, he bangs a club and someone runs and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah,
but
knuckle dragger, right?
He's very smart guy.
That's totally knuckle dragger. That's it. And but he's not, and because he's shown the empathy of these animal beings. And so it's actually this conversation with George Schaller, who's this biologist who had spent a lot of time in the not in a lab or going to stacks in the libraries, but rather among the animals themselves. And George said, and I asked, there was a lion there as well. It's an African lion because it's a big mane, and there's a female coming up to nuzzle and lick him. And I asked George, what is it doing? And he said, well, I've seen that before. Maybe she's coming up to lick what he ate. Maybe she's coming up to say hello. Maybe she hasn't seen him for a long time. She's reuniting. So George is telling me about all these touching scenes between the animal beings, which is absolutely fascinating. And George's work went on to influence Jane Goodall and how she approached chimpanzees in the wild, and many other famous wildlife biologists for the past. So it was a learning experience that I was getting away from the numbers and the science of this whole thing, which is where I started by counting the dots on this cave panel. And I'd said that earlier that this millions of people have seen this panel, have seen this image in the media, and it had been discovered over 100 years ago. So what we're looking at here is not something anybody hadn't actually seen before, but everybody was fixated on the red dots. And in Miguel, in your world, what are the red things that incite you?
Well, they seem to have definitely a uniform pattern, so they seem to be saying something. Like you said, it's not, or Van said, it's not some knuckle. This guy's dragging their knuckles, just randomly putting things. There is a communication there.
How about in your daily life? What is the red that you see?
Well, yes, I think my brain is preconditioned, must be biologically conditioned to be alerted to red, right?
Well, that is a theory. So what are the red things that incite you? How about a red stop sign?
Exactly. Red definitely does. Or yes, red is, or the red car, or the red Mustang, something like that. It catches my attention.
Yeah, people used to say never buy a red car because you're going to get hit. You're more likely to hit. And you drive down any strip in a town, you'll see red embedded in McDonald's signs, Dairy Queen, Burger King. You just go down the line, Coca-Cola. And they didn't stumble across that by accident. That comes from the work of Nicholas Tinbergen. And we're going to go to biology just for like 2 minutes here. Nicholas Tinbergen was a Dutch biologist who won a Nobel Prize. And the work that he won it for was his book, The Study of Instinct. And Tinbergen had by his window a big fish tank. And in the fish tank, he had 3-spined sticklebacks, which is a kind of prey fish for the bigger fish. And every day this red delivery truck came by, the sticklebacks went into a defensive posture. And he could see this. So, normally they just muddle around eating, chasing each other. And all of a sudden they just stare out the window. So Tinbergen reasoned that, he recognized that these sticklebacks can't think. They don't have the brains that as we have them. So it had to be brainstem dominated. And so it's an instinctual reaction that we have to the red. We're drawn to the red. And that's what Tinberger found. And that work went on to become the Bible for Madison Avenue and how to create signage and advertising for commercial industry. And that's why we're stimulated by the red stop sign. We live in a blue-green world, and red contrasts with that. So when you looked at the red discs, you saw the same thing. And the millions of other people, they fell for this optical psychological trick that we're drawn to the red. And by being drawn to the red, we don't see the forest through the trees, or in this case, the savanna through the red dots. We don't see the elephant in the room. Is that a big wow for you, Miguel?
No, this is great stuff. And so we definitely want to unpack more of this and go down your book and, cover it all. But for the listener that might not know, because, yes, the audience is very educated, but focus more on ancient religion and, of course, myth, which we'll get into. But what exactly is Paleolithic?
So Paleolithic is a term to use of people that are hunter-gatherers in a pre-Neolithic time, so pre-agricultural time. But we used to say that was, before 8,000 years ago, but that all has changed because, Native Americans were farming of sorts, and they were hunter-gatherers at the same time. So when I use Paleolithic, I'm using, in terms of the art, so we're for more than 12,000 years ago. But it's really depending on what country you're in, what land, and what is the technological level. It could shift around. But this is Paleolithic Europe, so we're talking, archaeological terms, 12, 13,000 years ago.
That makes sense.
This is before Stonehenge. This is 7,000 years before Stonehenge, 9,000 years before the Giza pyramids. That's the most recent part of the Paleolithic. But we're talking these caves down in El Castillo 34 to 40,000 years ago. So we're so far back in time, it's unimaginable.
It is indeed, and especially when you realize that, as you mentioned, as we keep talking, these were not, might say these were not knuckle draggers, and you talk about they already had their own myths. Tell us about what they believed in those days, or what was the symbols that were really affecting them.
Well, how I've perceived this is that there's a common root to mythology in an era before we can think of time. So back into this Paleolithic. That source is in a not distant place on the outskirts of our imagination. It's still within us. So their mythology of 40,000 years ago is the same mythology we have today. And the reason goes back to the work as described in Carl Jung, the Swiss psychoanalyst Carl Jung, who you've did some reflections on in other programs. Jung said that there's archetypes. And we recognize archetypes. We see the damsel in distress. We see the knight in shining armor. We see the old and the young. We see the teacher and the apprentice. We see the dragon. The dragon could be be transposed into Darth Vader, the evil witch. Find a villain, and that's the dragon. And these are archetypes that are in us. And when we see the images or we hear the story, we can tell where it's going based on these archetypes. And that work of Jung was explored further or systematized by Joseph Campbell in his work, A Hero with a Thousand Faces. And he calls this the consummation of these archetypes into a myth, a monomyth. There's one great story. And to some degree, Campbell was right. And throughout my book, I demonstrate that there are great stories, great monomyths that go deep into time, but there's actually multiple stories. So Campbell was right that it is part of us. And going back to Jung further, this is something deep within our archetypes we recognize in our collective unconscious. Now, Jung had a dream early in his life. And in this dream, he walks into an old house. And as he goes down the hallway, the plaster starts coming off. But he recognizes that this plaster is not from the old house, but from ancient Greece or Rome. So he's stepping back in time. He goes further down the hallway, and he steps into a cave. And he recognizes that this is, in his mind, this is a Paleolithic cave. And that if you want to find the answers to our past, You need to go that far back in time. You need to understand where we came from and go into the mind of the hunter-gatherer. And when you remember the movie, so we're both movie buffs. The second episode of Star Wars, Luke Skywalker Yoda is saying this is the cave and to go into it, and Luke says, well, what do I need to bring into the cave? And Yoda comes back and says, the only thing you need to bring into the cave, the only thing you can bring is yourself, because that's the only thing you're going to find in the cave. Well, that concept goes back to Jung. So Jung, after he wakes from his dream, he goes through the mythological literature and recognizes that there is this core story, that these archetypes are transposed around the world, and that is that monomyth and how we keep track of stories. And so this is all part of us. So the myths that we had in the distant past, people saw humans as humans, but they also saw humans as animal beings, that they transposed to them, just as Mickey Mouse has a human character as Donald Duck. And we have movies that there's mixtures of people talking with animal beings. So people in the past had that same concept because it's somewhere deep within us. And the stories we tell they're fundamentally the same. Because when we today look at those stories in the Paleolithic, we see the same characters. And we take that history, that literature that has been passed down from the deep past, and we can understand what the story is and where it's going. And that goes to that monomyth, that core hero's journey that Joseph Campbell popularized through Star Wars.
Makes sense and well said. And so why we saying ancient man, as you saw in the caves in El Castillo, what was the reason they wanted to create art? What exactly these drawings do?
Good question. We're going to take that a step back further. And you had asked me recently another question previously about the cosmic man.
Yes, that was, one of the concepts that jumped out when I read your book was the cosmic man. And of course, I thought of the cosmic Adam of the Kabbalists, and the Gnostics talk about this primal man that was up there in the stars. So it's a fascinating concept. And you talk about this in your book that happened 40,000 years ago.
Yeah. Well, we can document it back there but I think it goes back millions of years before that. And can you imagine if you lived in a cave? You were raised in a cave. You had never seen the night sky. You'd never seen images of anything. And then at age 6 or 7, you walk out into the night sky and you see all the stars in the night sky at one time, if it was possible. Which constellation do you believe that you would recognize first?
Ursa Major, something like that.
Ursa Major would be a good one. Okay, what's another one?
Perhaps Orion?
Orion.
Yes,
so
that's all I can
Ursa
think of.
Major would make sense if you've seen an animal, but if you've never seen an animal being walking around, it would be Orion, because Orion has the look of a man, and Orion hasn't changed in our perception. Hasn't changed throughout time. It's a very distant constellation, so it doesn't. The pieces of the puzzle or the constellation don't move around relative to how we see them. Whereas Sirius jumps around a lot because it's closer to us. So Orion is this figure of the man. And what I believe is that many millions of years ago, an individual, some sort of being, bipedal like us, looked up to the night sky and saw his image or her image. And that became the first recognition of art as we can imagine it. And then this person noticed that this being in the sky moved across the sky throughout the night, and also disappeared, came and gone throughout the seasons. And when it left in the season, perhaps it died. And when it came into the light, came into the dark, into the night sky, it was reborn. And when the constellation travels to the night sky and approaches to the dawn, it's reborn as well, in a symbolic way. So I believe that Orion was the first constellation that was found by man. That everything else, Ursa Major does kind of look like an animal, but most of the constellations don't look like anything. They're not consistent like anything. People have all kinds of different names.
Right.
So this cosmic man, I believe, goes back distant in time, in a place in a time we couldn't even imagine. And then the Paleolithic man, or the Paleolithic artist, took it, and that became part of the mythology. And that became the first story of this hero on his journey. But he doesn't, because Orion isn't in the sky all the time, he wants to tell a story that goes throughout the year. So he captures other constellations. One of them is Hercules. And Hercules, in Paleolithic, stood face to face across the sky from each other. And seasonally, when one set, the other rose. So you had this hero in the sky all the time, which became that cosmic man. And around the world, we find Orion. We find him among the Ojibwe and the Great Lakes of North America. He's called the Winter Maker. And Orion was Osiris among the ancient Egyptians. He's Ruinton in Siberia, and he's Aminar in the Sahara. So this concept of the cosmic man, or Orion in the night sky, is a worldwide phenomenon among people that we ordinarily wouldn't think as connected cultures. But in fact, they do connect through all this cosmology or mythology. Are you ready for that?
I'm ready.
Yeah, it's well, this was an evolutionary process for me to come to recognize these things, because I was looking for animals. Started looking for horses, and then I found the elephant. I found lions, and so on and so forth. But then I started realizing that there was an interesting mythological concept in these Paleolithic caves, is that they would overlap characters on top of each other. So you'd have the eagle on top of a horse, which gives the horse wings. You find that the Hercules constellation over the horse as well. And then, a man becomes the horse. You find a man which overlaps with a dolphin. And then, so he becomes Silken of the Irish, or the male mermaid of the Greeks. And so our mythological heritage comes from this place where we mixed and matched animals that overlapped with each other, or beings, human and animal beings, and they become spiritual creatures. And so this work is taking us back very far back than anybody possibly could imagine in our modern time. Now, you've done a lot of reading on Jung. How do you think Jung would have felt about this?
Oh, he certainly would have been very intrigued, and I think as other experts have shown on the show, like John Lundwall or old shows with Acharia S., all our myths are connected to the stars, and there's an astrotheology to it. But because modern man has, especially in our days, last 100 years or so, has forgotten to even look at the sky, none of us really look at the sky, we've forgotten it. So I think even Jung was a man of his time, so he might have not really connected how important the movement of the stars, the as above, as below thing was going, or the theory of correspondence. I think Jung really would have added another dimension, but he certainly got it right with the archetypes and so forth.
Yes, and absolutely. And he said something in his writing that he had met many famous people throughout his life, and the most interesting person he met was himself in the collective unconscious. So and I had that kind of same experience to writing this book. George Showers heavily influenced me on the animals and finding out where they're from, and the empathy and so on. But this all came from inside of me. And so I think that, kind of tying back to what you just said, that myths are passed through the seasons of the night sky as constellations and stars, projecting man's psyche onto the cosmos. Characters are light years from Earth, but still within the grasp of the human imagination. And that this astro cosmology, these astro myths that we find, they're in us because we recognize these patterns. And then these patterns we find the stories. And it continues on throughout time, throughout peoples around the world. And we fundamentally still tell the same story today, because we project our psyche into the cosmos. When we look at the stars, we find these characters. I believe that the concept of the angel is also found in this Paleolithic art. Do you remember the avianoid characters in the book?
Yes, I did. They were fascinating.
What was when you saw those? What was your sense of that? What was your interpretation?
Well, of course, I look at it symbolically. Again, as a modern person, I saw it as a symbol of flight or freedom.
Interesting. Well, this avianoid, or the Birdman, the shaman that puts on his mask, is a common theme, a motif throughout the world among indigenous peoples and the ancients. What's significant about these Paleolithic images, if we say they're the first angels or the first avianoids, we have to look at a distinct feature about them. It's that you can see that the character, the shamanic character, is wearing a mask. Because under the mask, because we can see the chin, we can see other human-like features, so that the person transforms himself into the avianoid versus the avianoid coming down from the great beyond. And when I started to recognize that, because it was not just it was in multiple images, that this concept of the angel, or the many other words we use for it in our technological time, it's man's own projection. We project our psyche into the cosmos, and in that cosmos, in the great beyond, we make those characters as a mirror of ourselves, as opposed to the great beyond making us a mirror of him or her. And that concept, that avianoid that we find in this Paleolithic image is the root of all those things. Now, going back to Jung, have you ever heard of the Philemon Society?
Yes, I have heard of them, yes.
Cool. Philemon was a avianoid character that accompanied Jung, that really is a character that came out of his unconscious.
Right, in the Red Book, that's his guide.
That's his guide.
Mm-hmm.
So Jung is guided by this avianoid character. Well, he wasn't the only one. King David of the Jews was aided by Gabriel, Angel Gabriel. Gabriel comes to the Virgin Mary to tell her that she's going to have a son. Gabriel brings wisdom to Muhammad in a cave and helps him to fulfill his prophecy. So this concept of the angel is among many people throughout time and around the world. But this person comes from that individual comes from within ourselves as we tap into that collective unconscious. And some people do it, more fluidly than others. And Jung, as you mentioned, his Red Book came from his work with Philemon. His conversation with Philemon. And the Red Book wasn't released until after Jung's death. He didn't want it released. Because he was afraid that people wouldn't respect his work if they recognized what one of his influences were. And so it's almost like a supernatural component. But if you consider it from the Jungian standpoint, it's really, he's diving into his collective unconscious. He's going back to the cave of his mind, to that deepest point in the Paleolithic, where he can find these archetypes and put them into a motif and a structure that can then be understood. Of course, that's where Joseph Campbell comes on. And what were the other characters that you kind of interested in the cave?
Well, one question I had for you, you talk about how maybe some, like the bear is not in all societies and so forth. But one, I think, image you talk about that is prevalent in most societies is that of the horse. What does the horse mean, Bernie?
I'm not a horse person. And it's not that I don't think they're magnificent animals. Horses, a lot of work. So most of what I know about horses come from horse people friends that I have and my readings of the literature. And in the literature, in the let's say the mythological literature, the horse is that vehicle for freedom, or to transcend in the beyond. In the Siberian traditions, shamanic traditions, the shaman takes the horse and rides into the night skies. In Abrahamic traditions, Abraham takes the horse between his wife and his mistress overnight so that he can, because they're in two different places. Muhammad takes the horse on his cosmic journey. It's a common vehicle. And there's an interesting story about Jung, that James Joyce and Blake were all, I believe those are three characters, were in different earthquakes. And in those earthquakes, the first feeling that came to them was that being thrown off a horse. Well, in the Greek tradition, Pegasus, the flying horse, throws the hero Bellerophon off of him after he defeats the monster Chimera. So there's the horse is this vehicle for us to transcend into the beyond. If you go to a TriStar Pictures at the theater, the first image that pops up is the horse Pegasus, the swinging horse, because and TriStar is tapping into our collective unconscious with this archetypal character that you're now going to transcend into the beyond through this cinematic production. So the horse has many meanings, but the clear one is that somewhere deep inside of us, this horse takes us on that spiritual journey. It's the vehicle. It's the spaceship of today that takes us into the great beyond to meet one of the two great mysteries.
Makes sense, because I think I read somewhere that once the horse was introduced in America to the natives, their mythologies just exploded. Their minds just exploded. So that symbol, that animal, even in the psyche of the Native Americans, really changed their whole consciousness.
Yes, I could see that as well. Because they're being now faced with an archetypal character they had in their collective unconscious in the past that stimulates it. It's an incredible idea, and I believe that the most common animal depicted in Paleolithic art is, number one, the horse. Number two is the bison, and I believe that horse is there because it is that vehicle for the shamanic initiate or the shaman himself to take that journey, and that same journey that we carry within ourselves and throughout Mediterranean Abrahamic traditions. It is that the horse that takes us on the spiritual journey into the great beyond. So yeah, it's a big one for all those horse lovers out there.
Yes.
It's also, I have horse friends, and some of them have young daughters, and with the young girl bonds with the horse. So she's bonding with something so more powerful than herself. And I believe that the Paleolithic artists weren't riding horses because these horses don't look like they're ridden. They don't have that saddle broken look about them. And in the images, they're not holding the mane or around the neck. They've got the hands up in the air. So I don't believe they're actually riding a horse as we see it today. But young people, especially young women, because the horse industry is dominated like 95% by women. I believe that they capture into that spiritual bondingness through their equestrian practice. And it's a beautiful pursuit.
Wow, that's really awesome stuff. And you were talking about the shaman. What do you think from your research was the role of the shaman 40,000 years ago? Was it the same as it is in the ancient past?
Well, I use that word shaman in this interview, and I use about halfway through the book. And the shaman is the spiritual leader, the teacher, the person who guides the apprentice. And I believe that these caves were books of knowledge that could be passed on from one generation to the next. And people probably didn't live very long at those times. They might have lived 30, 40, possibly even 50 years. So there had to be something, a guidebook for them to keep moving on, not just a mythological story that they passed by word or through the campfires. So I believe that the shaman who passed on to the initiate is the one who guides through this process. And if the shaman dies early, there's enough information on the cave wall for the apprentice to keep it going forwards. Now, we talked about these red discs on this panel, this gallery of discs at El Castillo Cave. And I believe that the red discs were the test of the apprentice. That could the apprentice see the forest of the trees? Could the apprentice see multiple realities? And if someone looks at that panel long enough and they still can't see anything, they probably wouldn't make a very good shamanic teacher, because they wouldn't be able to see those multiple perspectives, and they wouldn't be able to tell the story. So I believe that seeing through past those red discs was the first test of the initiate. And if they didn't pass the test, they didn't become a shaman. But I'd be willing to bet that before the initiate even walked in that cave, there were other tests that were given to see if they had this ability to see beyond the red discs and what was most obviously apparent. Because there can be many realities, as you've discussed on your programs. You've had many guests who've expressed completely different points about the same thing, but there's a truth in all of them. But we have to see these multiple. We have to accept that there can be multiple realities, and there's never a knowing. There's never a singular truth. That everybody comes from a different perspective. We have different hardware in our brains, and this can be slightly different histories. There can be multiple realities, and there's really never a right or wrong. It's each individual's interpretation of a singular truth.
Yes, indeed. And I think you even mentioned this, and other guests have mentioned this. We work on a sort of linear paradigm, but an ancient man, if they saw an animal or a tree, they saw multi-levels. They saw a god, they saw the stars, they saw food, they saw a living thing. I mean, they really saw things completely different than we did.
Yeah, and there's an interesting effect. When you look at the gallery disc image, for example, and you start seeing the animals, and your mind can just drift back and forth between them on the main image without them being outlined, your brain gets rewired, and you will start seeing more animals in the clouds than you've ever seen before. And this has no drugs involved. You'll see, figures in bushes. So I believe that there's a reprogramming involved in your mind by seeing these images as these overlapping images that you can just fade quickly, either blink in and out of them or fade in and out of them. That your mind has the ability to see multiple perspectives at the same time. It's sort of like if you're at the dinner table, long table, and you take four water glasses and stagger them down to the end of the table. It's about being able to see them all at the same time in focus, and be able to shift back and forth between them. And that's the same. I believe that's the same perspective that the Paleolithic artists created in these caves. And to do that, it changes your reality, but it changes how your brain is wired. And so you will have a different perspective on how you see things, as well as you'll see more. You'll see things you've never seen before without doing hallucinogenic drugs. And I believe that's an optical trick that kind of warps your brain a little bit. And I went through that experience about 3.5 years ago. And as I went deeper into these images, and I learned how the artist created them and how their methodology was and what they were seeking to teach, my mind shifted that I could see things differently, not just in the art, but in life as well.
Yes, and for the audience, Bernie has a chapter where he recreates the interaction with the shaman and the pupil, and I found it very powerful. I felt myself going back in time and really experiencing what they were experiencing, this initiation, this intimate initiation. How did you go about, you might say, recreating or going there? I mean, like any good historian, I believe, you were really trying to get into the consciousness of those people in those times.
Yeah, it was a journey. And so what you're looking at in the book is the final journey, because the bigger picture. And we have to remember that these people were animists, and animists who believe, so they're pre-shamanic people. Animists believe that the mountains have spirits, the rivers have spirits, and animals have spirits, and everything has spirits. The stars are spirits, and constellations are just bigger spirits. So you have to put yourself in the mind of the animist. How would they see the world? And kind of go back to Jung a little bit. Jung said that myths are things that happened. What I would transpose that a little bit, I would say that myths are things that are experienced. And so when you see the stars in the night sky and you find images of them in them, they are things that happen, but they're really experienced because we recognize now that Ursa Major is not a bear in the night sky. So so going back to this concept, how do you put yourself in the Paleolithic mind is consider yourself as an animist. How does an animist see the world? And it's a phenomenal, but that's how Native Americans did it that way. So you can put yourself in the mind of a Native American, Chief Sitting Bull, and how he viewed the great mystery of Wakantanka. And you can kind of see how the Paleolithic mind would have worked to create these images and the myths that they explored. And what's really fascinating about this is that we're telling fundamentally the same stories we did 40,000 years ago. In some cases with the same characters, such as the winged horse Pegasus. That takes the hero on the journey into the great beyond. So we haven't really changed that much, and perhaps there's something about us that we have solidified these archetypes in our collective unconscious that we really can't get away with them. We keep telling the same stories. We put a different head on the horse. One has spots and one doesn't. But fundamentally, we're telling the same stories. And so I don't believe it's that difficult to go back to the Paleolithic mind, because the Native Americans of North America tell fundamentally the same stories as ancient Greeks. The ancient Greeks are a little more elaborate in their, but they're telling the fundamental story of the journey and self-discovery and how you can learn about yourself and others through the mythology. But it was a journey, and that part of my journey is done. I'm not writing any more books. Now's my time to share the story.
Yes, and what a great story you're sharing. I mean, this is really engaging and fascinating. What about you, Vance? Do you have a question?
Yeah, Bernie, you think that our state of mind as children maybe approximates that of the old ancient peoples? Because I remember driving to my grandmother's house, which was just before the Lincoln Tunnel in New York City, in the viaduct. And up on the viaduct, there used to be a mobile station with the Pegasus, the red rotating Pegasus, all decked up in neon. It was like a mystical experience for me seeing the horse. I'd wait for that, And so, and similarly, I've always been fascinated with the legend of Sirius and the dog star and so forth. In fact, it goes deeper than that, but I won't go into it now. But what about the dogs in entry into the Paleolithic lifestyle? What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, the dog and Sirius, that's a big one. That's I did almost a chapter on that one in the book out of 18 chapters. But yes, we do go into the mind of the child as an animist, and we see the world prior to everything we learn in the first grade. So Sirius as a dog. Sirius as Sirius is the brightest star in the night sky, and around the world, it's not universal, but around the world, people see Sirius as a dog, or they see a constellation around Sirius as a dog. It's the motif that connects everybody. But Sirius doesn't look like the star. Sirius doesn't look like a dog, and the constellations people make as Canis Major don't look like a dog either. Whereas Orion looks like a man. So we have this mythology of the cosmic man in the sky being followed by a dog. That's the fundamental myth, and that's where Sirius comes in. And in Sirius, it's very typical in mythology that Sirius, or the dog, is the guardian. It's either the guardian that helps the cosmic man on his journey through the great beyond or the underworld, or it's actually a guard to the underworld. So in death, we take out, we say all dogs go to heaven, and there are Native American graves from thousands of years ago that they had dogs with them. It's the only animal they had buried in was a dog. So the dog has been our best friend for a very long time, tens of thousands of years before cats. And for all the cat lovers out there, it's just what it is. In fact, there are domesticated images of domesticated dogs in these Paleolithic images, so we can tell they're domesticated because they have down ears. But there are also possibly wild canids as well with up ears. And some of these dogs with down ears are identical to dogs in our modern time. And so Sirius as a dog is this motif around the world that we all identify with. It's the brightest star in the night sky. It's our guardian into the afterlife. Does that help you?
Oh yeah, yeah.
No, the question, Bernie, is why would they be, as you say, guardians of the underworld? Most would think of Anubis, the Egyptian god.
Sure. Well, Anubis is an Egyptian version, and some people see, if you go around the world, the great beyond or the afterlife could be in the night sky, or it could be under the earth. And in the case of the Paleolithic caves, that could be an entrance into the underworld. So Hercules goes into a cave, which takes him down into Hades. Okay. And on that journey, he fights the Cerberus, the three-headed dog. And in the Gorum etching, which is shown in the book, we have this three-headed dog that looks, could be interpreted as the Cerberus. So the great beyond, Native Americans, they typically didn't say it was under the ground. The Greeks said the underworld, and the Egyptians said the underworld was under the ground. So it's all a vehicle how you get there. And I believe that part of the way this concept came up was that when Orion travels across this night sky, when he approaches a mountain, he looks like he's climbing it, a very tall mountain. When he enters into the mountain, he has entered into the cave of the mountain. And when he emerges from the cave, the mountain from behind the mountain, he's reborn. So I believe that this concept of whether it's you find the afterlife in the night sky, you find it in the cave in the underworld, goes back to the concept of Orion as he transits across the night sky, and what does he overlap with? Whether it be a mountain, he would be going to the cave that is the underworld, which is a common motif in ancient Mediterranean societies. That's a big one, guys.
Yes, indeed. I mean, and what about Hercules? So obviously in modern times, we think of Hercules as this big stud, Dwayne Johnson or something. This, nice hero who's not very smart, and people wonder, why was he so important to the ancient times? But basically, Hercules was the cosmic man, to be clear.
So there's a cosmic man on his journey, and in the Paleolithic art, the cosmic man starts as a human on Earth. He transforms, he becomes an avianoid in the night sky, and he starts his journey through the seasons as Hercules. And at the end of his journey, he transforms into Orion. So, and they face in the night sky in the Paleolithic. They're actually, one is directly to the north, and the other in the south in the night sky at the same time. So one is the mirror of the other. The Greeks split them apart. And they gave some stories to Hercules, and they give some stories to Orion. And there's more ancient origins of the Orion and Hercules stories that had them as a single character. And Robert Graves, a Greek mythologist, wrote a lot about this. So Robert Graves said, they gave some to Hercules and gave some to Orion, but it's fundamentally the same story. And that's what the Paleolithic record shows, that the stories there's a common story that was split apart. Graves also talks about the labors of Hercules. So kind of in a nutshell, Hercules gets drunk. He kills off his family. And by this horrendous deed, he has to do these labors to actually a relative is telling him that you're now my servant. I don't want you to take my position as a king. It's his cousin Euripides, and I'm going to send you in these impossible journeys, these possible deeds that you're obviously going to fail. You're going to get killed at. Well, Hercules goes through all these deeds, or these Herculean feats, and he ultimately succeeds in all of them. And on his last feat, he enters into the underworld. And he's the first person that has gone into the underworld, and on this journey, and he comes out whole. Prior to going to the underworld, he goes to a place. He goes to Mount Atlas, which is now we call Jebel Tobakal. And Mount Atlas is that same place that we thought that the origin, or the only indigenous place we have of the Barbary Macaque that ape that was bouncing off the roof of James Bond's cars or Jeep when he was coming down the slopes of Gibraltar. So Hercules in mythology travels to that same place as we find this Barbary macaque. It's like a unique identifier. If we think of there's only pandas outside of zoos. There's only pandas in China, and we think of the panda. We think of the bald eagle as a symbol of the United States. And if you go around the world, people typically pick some sort of animal that is unique to that environment to express what it is. In this case, they chose the Barbary macaque as a signifier for this place of Mount Atlas that is now Jebel Tobakal, which is the highest mountain in North Africa. So in the story, in the mythology, Hercules goes on this journey, all these different feats, and he has to prove himself. And in the end, he's ultimately set free. But I believe that the original story, and Graves, who's now deceased, would agree, is that Orion and Hercules are the same person on the journey, and one transforms into the other. And Orion, when he goes into the night sky, is the ultimate transcendence. And on the gallery of this image, Hercules is to the north of the image where there's European animals, and Orion is to the south where there's the giraffe and elephant and Barbary macaque. So he takes this journey through the night sky, and he finds that moment of transcendence at the end of his journey in that place of the Barbary macaque on that cosmic mountain that we now find all around the world in mythology and the beliefs of people.
Well said, well said. Well, I think we've come to the end of our own hero's journey. Vince, thanks for being here and keeping things going and keeping the internet up.
Okay, I'll work my magic as much as I can.
Yes, you are the Janus of this show. But Bernie, thank you very much for coming on Aeon Byte and giving us really an amazing discussion based on your book, Before Orion.
Well, Miguel, advance in the background. Thanks for having me. And people can find more information on my webpage, beforeorion.com, some YouTube videos that have some more images, which is beforeorion.com, the dot spelled out. I'm on Twitter and other places. You can go to my webpage. You can make the connections and just join me on the journey. Let's learn more about ourselves and see where we're going.
Yes, indeed. And on the show notes, I'll have links to Bernie's webpage. And yes, while you're listening to this, please look at some of the images and meditate on these images so we can really find the connection between the ancients, which I think will give us a connection to the stars, which will take us beyond the stars eventually. So great stuff. And I love your work. So again, thanks for being on, Bernie. Really enjoyed it.
Let's do another show.
Let's do it. And there you have it, the first part of an engaging interview with Bernie Taylor on his book, Before Orion. I hope you're getting closer to unleashing your inner hero of 1,000 faces and reversing the fragmentation of the virus we call reality. It gets better, though. In our second part, Bernie will get into ancient Egyptian lore, including evidence their monuments are much older than ever believed, and some startling scholarship about the Sphinx. We'll also discuss some supreme Roman gods and whether or not the ancients might have used entheogens to expand their consciousness. We as well deal with the fascinating Tuareg people of the Sahara and what insights they give us on the history of consciousness. Bernie doesn't just stay technical, granting us approachable tools and exercises on how we can access the power of myth I discuss in the introduction, getting us back to a less fragmented reality and seeing beyond the stars. And we'll talk about much, much more. Don't miss it. Only $5.99 a month to join. You get complete and not partial shows. You get access to more than 380 episodes with the best and brightest in Gnosticism, Western esoteric, and free thought. You get your own private RSS feed where you can listen to all complete shows on the podcatcher of your choice. And for patrons at Patreon, we now have an exclusive one for you. you get an invitation to our Inner Sanctum of Gnosis Facebook group. Many past guests hang out there, like Robert Price, Tim Freak, Andrew Phillips Smith, Scott Smith, Steve D., Robert Sullivan, and more. And I'm always there to directly and personally answer your questions and issues, and give you news on the show before it even happens. Same benefits if you become a patron at Patreon, except you get early shows. If anything, a few shekels here and there via PayPal or the US mail really, really helps. Let's keep this independent media going before reality becomes so fragmented we all develop the attention span of a goldfish on blue crystal meth. Reality bites, but this is where the aeons bite back. I'm glad you're here with me to discover your own hero's journey. You deserve it. Hello and goodbye as always.